So, good afternoon, everyone, for the second lecture in the FEL Priestley Lecture Series of 2024. My name is Sally Tagliamonte, and I'm the acting principal of University College. I'm also a professor of linguistics and a Canada Research Chair in Language Variation and Change. Let's come together today in a good way with our intellectual curiosity, openness to new ideas, and a common goal to learn more about historical perspectives on the Caribbean. But before we look into the past, I would like to begin with where we're standing right now. Let's take a moment to reflect on the fact that for thousands of years, this land has been the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. It remains a vibrant meeting place for Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are honored to have the opportunity to work here with appreciation for the Indigenous heritage and culture in our midst. Indeed, as you leave the college today, take a walk through the Zibing Indigenous landscape on the east side of the college building this way. This lovely garden is named for the ancient creek that once passed through these grounds. Sibing means river in Anishinaabemowin. The FLE Priestley Memorial Lectures in the History of Ideas were funded by a group of Professor Priestley's former students. We have one of them with us here today, Mr. Phil Anisman, who was the catalyst that brought those students together to create the endowment that enables us to invite these amazing world-class leaders. The topics of their research reflect Professor Priestley's broad interest in the history of ideas and honor his extraordinary teaching acumen. In this regard, we are extremely happy to have Professor Matthew Smith here with us. Professor Smith is a professor of history and the director of the Center for the Study of the Legacies of British Slavery. He joined University College London after many years of working at the University of the West Indies in Mona in Jamaica, where he was professor of Caribbean history. His research is pan-Caribbean in scope with special interest in the 19th and 20th centuries of Haiti and Jamaica. Today is the second of 3 lectures. Yesterday, we heard about Haiti. Today, we'll hear about the Caribbean more generally, and tomorrow, Jamaica. Before we introduce Professor Smith, I want to give you some quick housekeeping notes. Those of you attending in person, a microphone will be passed around during the question and answer portion of today's lecture. Please raise your hand to ask a question once the lecture concludes. When you do, speak into the microphone rather than speaking without one in order for our audience at home to hear your questions. Bonnie is monitoring the online audience. For those attending virtually, live closed captioning is available for this event. The option can be turned on by clicking the closed captioning icon at the bottom of your Zoom stream. Please use the Zoom chat function to submit your online questions. I now call upon Professor Melanie Newton to introduce our distinguished speaker from a disciplinary perspective. Melanie?
Thank you so much. It is my great pleasure for the second time, actually third, because we had the seminar today, to introduce my friend and colleague, Professor Matthew J. Smith. I'm so thrilled that you were able to join us again. It's been 10 years. I actually ran into a colleague today, the current chair of the undergraduate history department, who remembers the last time you were here and the talk that you gave and how wonderful it was. So thank you for being back here again. So, as Professor Tagliamonte mentioned, Professor Smith is Professor of History at University College London, and he is the Director of the Center for the Study of the Legacies of British Slavery, which is one of a couple of digital history databases that has completely transformed the field of Atlantic world slavery and emancipation. The other one is the Atlantic Slave Trade Database, or now called Slave Voyages. But these two databases, in terms of the kind of digital humanities work that is coming out of this field are remarkable. And the Legacies of British Slavery database has transformed conversations about slavery's impacts, not just in the United Kingdom, where the center is based, but across the former British slaveholding world, and I would argue is central to the ongoing conversation about reparations in the contemporary period. At the core of the database, and which is now a much bigger project than just a database, is an online encyclopedia of British slave owner. Contains information about every slave owner in the British Caribbean, Mauritius, or the Cape at the moment of abolition in 1833, all of the estates that the center's researchers identified in the British Caribbean in the period 1763 to 1833, and all of the slave owners, attorneys, mortgagees, and legatees that they have identified to date for the estates between those same dates. And it is based on the records of the Slave Compensation Commission, which was set up to manage the distribution of the £20 million compensation package from the British government at the time of emancipation. Let's be clear, that was paid to slave owners, not to formerly enslaved people, in case anyone in the room was not certain. And the compensation records are an incredible research document, an historical document, basically a more or less complete census of slave ownership in the British Empire at the end of slavery. Today at lunch, Professor Smith met with some graduate students and postdocs at the university and shared new work on the project, which is now expanded to think about the slave registration returns in Jamaica, and the slave registration returns, these were censuses of the enslaved population that began in the 1810s, and the last were about 1832 or 33, depending on the island. And he has shared the incredible work that is already coming out of just the beginning of their work on the Jamaican registration returns. So the work that the center is doing under the leadership of Professor Smith really is core to changing how we all relate to and think we relate to the past of slavery in the modern world. Last night's lecture in this room took us back to Haiti in the 1950s, a place of vibrancy and hope for political change and for democracy, a pivotal time in the island's history and in the history of the Caribbean. And it really got us to think about the interconnections between Haiti and the Anglophone Caribbean and the way that Haiti was imagined. But then also, as that 1950s moment ended in tragically with the rise of the Duvalier dictatorship in Haiti, the impact of that, both within Haiti and beyond, on how we remember that period of Haiti's history. And in many ways, tonight is a bit of a bridge between last night's lecture and tomorrow's, really leaning into that question of sort of memory work that both the Legacies Project and last night's lecture got us to thinking about. Because tonight we will be looking at the Caribbean after slavery, the first 5 decades, and really thinking about the first generation of freed people in the colonial Caribbean and how they chose to remember slavery in the first half century after emancipation. In British Jamaica, elites and non-elites advanced different presentations of the centuries of African enslavement that were shaped heavily by how each group viewed resistance, race, and their relationship to Imperial Britain. So we'll continue our journey through the Caribbean's epic historic history with Professor Smith tonight, and I am happy to turn over the microphone. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you for that.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Melanie. And thank you all for coming as well. It's good to see faces from last night's lecture and some new faces as well. I am very grateful to have you in company with me as we go on another journey into the Caribbean past. And I'm pleased to be here to share that journey with you. And also, just before I get started, to thank once again, I can't thank them enough, the staff here at University College who've made me feel so welcome and so well hosted. Sally and Abby and Georgia and Bonnie and everyone. Thank you so much for your work in making this possible. As Melanie mentioned, tonight's lecture is going to take us in a different direction. We spent time in the 20th century last evening, and tonight we're going to be going into the 19th century. But I hope it will be clear as we go on that journey what the connections are between what I covered last night and what I'll cover tonight. I expect that it is well known by some members of this college that Professor Priestley, in whose name this lecture is organized and in memory of, was an admirer of the extraordinary gifts of 19th century poet Alfred Lord Tennyson. Professor Priestley's 1971 book, Language and Structure in Tennyson's Poetry, is an erudite and skillful dissection of the poet's craft. In the discussion of Tennyson's legendary two-volume collection, Poems 1842, Priestley picks up on the marked changes in style since Tennyson's earlier book, Poems 1832, and shows how the decade in between, misunderstood at the time as Tennyson's years of silence, were in fact years of devoted honing, practice, and perfection of his poetry craft. In Priestley's forensic attention to the poems, he highlights the poet's move away from metric experimentation and obsessiveness with tonalities to an emphasis on what Priestley called, quote, the architecture of the poem. Now, poetry was a purposive art for the man who would become heralded as a voice of Victorian English verse. The structure, as much as the imagery, could be built with great care to transport the reader to more than emotion, but to a better understanding of life. Using Priestley's words, Tennyson was showing, quote, the varieties and total shape and structure, end quote, in the products of his métier. There is an outstanding poem in volume 1 of Poems 1842 that exemplifies this feature and which stands, in my regard, as one of Tennyson's masterpieces. It is Of All Sat Freedom on the Heights. Tennyson scholars have argued that the poem, like most of those in volume 1, was a thoroughly revised version of something he had been working on from at least 1834. The final version is one of the most moving odes to freedom as a concept that traveled and changed in that long period between the storming of the Bastille through to the revolution in Paris in 1830. And here is that poem. And by the way, the motif of the lighthouse, which careful observers will notice has been a motif in these lectures, is quite significant. Interestingly, that lighthouse was finished in 1842, the year this poem was published. It sits at the eastern end of the island of Jamaica, and it was the first cast iron lighthouse that was built in the Caribbean. But here are some key lines from the poem. Of all sat freedom on the heights, thunders breaking at her feet. Above her shook the starry lights, she heard the torrents meet. There in her place she did rejoice, self-gathered in her prophet mind, but fragments of her mighty voice came rolling on the wind. Then stepped she down through town and field to mingle with the human race, and part by part to men revealed the fullness of her face. Grave mother of majestic works, from her isle altar gazing down, who godlike grasps the triple forks and kinglike wears the crown. Her open eyes desire the truth, the wisdom of 1,000 years is in them. May perpetual youth keep dry their light from tears, that her fair form may stand and shine, make bright our days and light our dreams, turning to scorn with lips divine the falsehood of extremes. Beautiful poem. Victorian sentimentality is ingrained in each line. But the poem rises above that to lay claim to the social importance of freedom. Freedom is feminized. A human old woman, the grave mother in the lines in Tennyson's description, who has seen the bitter wrath of inhumanity. In that period, the 1830s, she has to step from her pinnacle to help alter the course of the world, stem the torrents at her feet by bringing wisdom to humankind, lost in conflict and in need of her majestic works. Now, it cannot be overlooked that Tennyson was then living in London while he was working on this poem. And it was at a time when the comment on freedom and what it meant in the British Empire was alive with the refreshed embrace of human freedom from slavery in its Caribbean territories. Those island colonies, which since the 17th century had defined themselves on African bondage, the collapse of chattel slavery was furiously debated by planters and political elites and valiantly resisted by many among the hundreds of thousands of bonded women, men, and children. In 1834, the British Parliamentary Act abolishing slavery in its Caribbean dominions was enforced. It was an incomplete freedom. All freed people were to work another 6 years as apprentices, a form of unfree labor designed in principle to prepare them for freedom, but in reality, a system which extended their exploitation by their former enslavers. The apprenticeship system was shortened to 4 years, and in 1838, the African and Creole majorities of the British Caribbean were finally freed from slavery. In the moment of jubilation, there was in the Caribbean, far from the halls of Westminster, evocation in verse on the glories of freedom. Now here's another poem written around the same time as Tennyson's, published anonymously in the Jamaican paper Morning Journal, and it's titled Negro Emancipation. And I'll just read a few lines from it. Against humanity her standard waves, inscribed with freedom to the land of slaves, and Britons roused with sacred ardor, join with hand and heart to aid her cause divine. Who at his post can slumber or can sleep, while suffering thousands unprotected weep, crushed by tyrannic powers' imperious sway, in anguish weep their sum of life away. And there is one who from his throne on high sees all our actions with a lumbering eye, who hears the wretched supplicating prayer and counts the tears of anguish and despair. And all his wrongs which man refused to heal, his proud oppressor shall forever feel, and weep in tears of penitence too late, the just reward of overwhelming fate. Now forgive my comparisons here between Tennyson and this anonymous poet, but I do wish to highlight one common element in them, and that is how freedom is depicted. It is a human figure, high on a throne. The allusions to Queen Victoria are unambiguous, bringing liberty to the oppressed and suffering hundreds of thousands of unfree Black people. This is an elite view of freedom from slavery. Freedom is something that arrives benevolently, not something that is taken or naturally due, a gift, not a right. The lyricism cannot detract from that conscious separation between those who are born free, who have decided in their own time and by dint of their own efforts to share that freedom with formerly enslaved Blacks. What is most important here is that this poet presents and shares with the free societies in the Caribbean and Europe a definition of liberty that racializes freedom. 1838 was not the first time that Caribbean people had started writing their own ideas of freedom. It was also not the first time that freedom from slavery had come to the region. A century before full freedom, Jamaican Maroons won their liberty from the British by a treaty. And more epically, freedom broke through the tight hold of bondage in the early years of the revolt in Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, which had resulted 40 years before the British Islands in an abolition act emancipating all the enslaved people in the French Empire, a change most immediately felt by the rebelling forces in the colony. That 1794 act was under threat of repeal when the French director took command in Paris in 1795. The great fear of Saint-Domingue's revolutionary leaders was that the French would betray them by reimposing slavery. Toussaint Louverture, the indisputable leader of the war-ravaged colony and avowed supporter of France, on November 5, 1797, wrote a letter to the Directoire, his second that autumn, in which he issued one of the most legendary defenses of Black freedom. And this is what Toussaint said. Could men who have once enjoyed the benefits of liberty look on calmly while it's taken from them? They bore their chains when they knew no condition of life better than that of slavery. But today, when they have left it, if they had 1,000 lives, it would sacrifice them all rather than to be subjected again to slavery. But no, the hand that has broken our chains will not subject us to them again. If, in order to reestablish servitude in Saint-Domingue, this were to be done, I declare to you that this would be to attempt the impossible. We have known how to confront danger to obtain our liberty, and we'll know how to confront death to preserve it. C.L.R. James, who I introduced in a different capacity to you last night, has written passionately on the importance of Toussaint's 1797 letter. In a 1965 public lecture that James gave at the University of the West Indies, Mona, titled A New View of West Indian History, James gave close analysis to Toussaint's words in this letter, finding in them traces of modern Caribbean ideas of freedom, born in the revolution that Toussaint led, maturing the Victorian era of Tennyson and emancipation, but with an altogether different meaning that could possibly be understood in Europe. This is what James said at that 1965 lecture. When West Indians became a people and started to take part in the world, they read the documents of Rousseau, Robespierre, Danton, Mira, the French Assembly. That was all they knew. So when they started to write, they wrote in the same tempo and in the same style. So when they began to write, they have an immense accumulation of material at their disposal and the language and all sorts of techniques. And then, in addition to that, and this is the important part, they are West Indian, in that they have to describe the life of the West Indian, and the West Indian only really knows one word. And he asked of his audience, I wonder what it is. At the back of the minds of all the writers, there is one word always. I wonder if you know what it is. It has been with us for 300 years. And of course, his audience in 1965 knew, as I'm sure you all do, that that word was freedom. To miss this important and unalterable truth of the Caribbean, that freedom lay at the heart of all its efforts, remembrances, monuments, and actions, was for James to miss the entire idea of the Caribbean, and especially the entire practice of West Indian history. This evening, I want to take up James's admonition by looking both at the idea of Caribbean freedom from slavery, that is what it was, and of Caribbean freedom, how it became, and of Caribbean freedom itself, its action of what it was before it became intertwined with anti-colonialism. Whether emancipation arrived by treaty, act, civil war, or revolution, freedom from slavery changed the order of things in the Americas. Islands and continental territories and countries who entered modernity as sites of brutal oppression, composed of unequal foreign emigrants, all there for the principal reason of exploitation and profit, were transformed. After slavery, the inequalities of each place, which had become normalized by their regimes, was scaffolded by how they defined a world where chattel slavery was in most respects eradicated. Slavery, as my examples show, was a particular condition. It was more than a denial of rights of an unfree labor force. It was violence, and it was legal ownership of people and the children of those people. The early generations of professional historians of slavery in the Caribbean took up this point in their work. They wanted to understand how the Caribbean of their era, the Caribbean of the 1940s through to the 1970s, came to be the way that it was. How, if the end of colonialism was to be a new freedom, then the process and failures of the earlier freedom from slavery had to be studied. They interrogated what Caribbean societies under slavery were using. Whatever evidences they could find were marshaled to that inquiry. Like James, they approached their work of the middle of the 19th century from the middle of the 20th century. This was the era of decolonization in Africa and the Caribbean, of civil rights and Black power. In their own lifetimes, they had moved from studious colonials on islands where there were forced British mores and an appreciation for the Victorian writers to become authoritative voices of the Caribbean past. Eric Williams arrived at his explanation of abolition and the correlation of British industrialization with slavery and emancipation by acknowledging the role enslaved people had in bringing forth their own freedom. The slaves, however, were not prepared to wait for freedom to come to them as dispensation from above, wrote Williams. The alternatives were clear: emancipation from above or emancipation from below, but emancipation, in all caps, he wrote. Elsa Govayo, a Guyanese historian of the Caribbean who I mentioned last evening, went further than Williams. Her goal was to examine what it was the enslaved were fighting against. To do this, she had to study the social and legal mechanisms of control of a large unfree Black population in the Caribbean and to make sense of what slavery was like for them. But it had to be sensible to an audience that was coming of age, as she was, at a time when the memory of slavery in the Caribbean was defined by the story of how it ended and not what it was. Studying slavery was imperative to making sense of the 20th century world. Like my examples of CLR James above, we might find a greater sense of how Gouveia saw her role as a historian by considering how she translated her research to a Caribbean public. In 1953, just a year after completing her doctorate at University College London, Gouveia accepted an invitation from the Jamaica National Students Movement to go on a series of public lectures to secondary schools across the island. Her aim was to let the students understand what the social conditions were like in the Caribbean prior to emancipation. She took time to describe the composition of the society, the small white planter class, the only slightly larger group of free coloreds, and the majority African population on free and owned, and how freedom could emerge from such conditions. When challenged by a student in one of those lectures to make these conditions appreciative to them, she told them that they had to imagine South Africa and the US South of their time to get what she said, quote, a fair idea of some of the conditions in the West Indies during the slavery days, end quote. Gouveia and her generation of historians of the 1950s and the generation of historians she trained in the decades that followed were moving beyond the British narrative in histories of the Caribbean, one that is still very much in dominance in national stories of slavery in Britain today, one of abolition and the successes of the anti-slavery society. She is moving beyond those narratives that defined slavery by the story of its termination. Their British contemporaries saw New World slavery as the abolitionists saw it, an evil, immoral sin, a peculiar institution that, like ancient slavery, had been relegated to the dustbins of a bygone time, thanks to the revolutionary achievements of the abolitionists. No one can dispute the import of British abolitionism and the triumphs it created. But for Gouveia, as evidenced by her response in 1953 to the students, it is not the story of abolitionism and the idea of freedom it created, but the idea of slavery itself that must first be studied. Slavery was a very real and very recent experience. That was her point at that 1953 lecture. And even more so her point at one of her final lectures delivered just a year before she died. She delivered a lecture to the History Teachers Association in Jamaica in 1979. And she explained what I always thought was an extraordinary explanation of how she saw the structure of Caribbean society and connecting it to slavery. One of the basic and fundamental principles of social organization in the West Indies by the later 18th century becoming the principle of racial differentiation, and this was backed by cultural differentiation. We get economic, social, political, racial, cultural divisions that tended to coincide and reinforce each other in this new West Indian society, the plantation economy. And that is the society we have inherited from the past, with all its emphasis on keeping down the blacks and all its emphasis on keeping up the whites. And that society is what was inherited by the West Indian colonies at the time that emancipation came, end quote. And it's really interesting to compare Gouveia's 1950s writings and surviving text of her lectures and Gouveia in the 70s. To come to grips with what freedom from slavery meant for the bondspeople of the Caribbean, the historian had to examine the world of the enslaved and not impugn their own expectations of what freedom should have meant to them. This, I believe, was James's intention in his comment on Toussaint's letter, and why he said the letter, while tonally Republican, had its own soul, and that soul was explicitly West Indian. It is just as necessary to appreciate how slavery and abolition evolved differently from colony to colony, place to place, and across the long century of emancipation. The century that began with the French decree in 1794 and ended with the Golden Law in Brazil in 1888. I focus in this lecture on the crescendo in the age of emancipation, the 5 decades after full freedom in the British colonies in 1838, taking my discussion up to the eve of US entry in the Cuban War for Independence, which produced new definitions of Caribbean freedom that were determined by relationships with empires old and new. To understand what freedom meant to the first generation of free people, we must return to the instant when it was issued. There had, prior to 1838, been a deep knowledge of freedom. Its shape was whatever the slave regime was not. Colonists and planters might have denied that their human property knew freedom, but it was a living thing that was always there around them. It was that essential factor that lit the torch that burned cane fields and destroyed coffee works. It was the motivation to walk, run, sail, and sneak through those tiny windows of opportunity when it was possible to do so. There was always, and at all times, a seeking of freedom in plantation societies. In 1838, freedom arrived more than concept, opportunity, imagination, or knowledge, but as a law, and it came to the apprentices as a set of principles and instructions. Consider the following words, spoken by Reverend James Watson, a pastor in the Scots Kirk Mission in Jamaica in late July 1838 in Hanover Parish. Watson traveled the parish by horse from plantation to plantation, where thousands of almost free black laborers gathered anxiously to hear and see what a white man of the cloth had to tell them about their freedom. These are Watson's words. The 1st of August is at hand. The day of your redemption is near. I trust you will enter upon your new condition with the proud determination to prevent to the very uttermost of your power anything like a reflection being cast upon that day, or upon the glorious cause of which it is the precursor. I cannot for a moment suppose that you would suffer the most glorious achievement of modern times to be handed down to posterity, stained and bloated with the record of the ingratitude and crimes of those whose freedom from slavery was on that day accomplished. This is an extraordinary statement to be telling people who are awaiting that moment at which they lay down their machetes and choose not to rush out of their thatch huts when the driver screams at them to start work. The audiences for Watson's speech were already thinking of freedom, imagining it as a celebration in a few days to come, by roasting fattened pigs and drinking and dancing, and then after the festivities, controlling, finally, their lives, and just as meaningfully controlling their time. Time, when measured in hours, days, or years, had not belonged to them since birth. They were governed by the hours of the plantation. But Watson was defining their freedom differently. It was in his words and those of his religious allies who on horseback rode across the sugar colonies to warn and direct and shame and lay the entire enterprise of universal liberty on the actions of the Africans and Creoles who were to become free. Here are more words from Watson that illustrate that point. On your good or bad behavior rests the cause of universal liberty. To the millions in different quarters of the globe who are still bound in the galling yoke of slavery, the sight of thousands of your oppressed countrymen are still wafted on the breezes of the sultry quest. And the sighs and groans and tears and cries must still go further unpitied, unrepressed, and unmitigated. If you in any way become stubborn or self-willed, if you hear no advice, and in spite of all that religion includes or gratitude suggests, return to idleness and apathy, and use your liberty as a cloak of maliciousness, then what will ministers say? What will religion say? What will your friends in England say? What will the united and uplifted voice of the world say? But that liberty has been dishonored in the house of her friends. Return to idleness. What a peculiar thing to say to people who were born into slavery. If freedom from slavery was variably defined in the British colonies by 1838, it had evolved into something else in Haiti 50 years after it was declared. In 1844, the president of the Republic, Jean-Pierre Boyer, the last revolutionary leader of Haiti, was overthrown by a coup. It was the first. All Boyer's predecessors had died in office, and most of his successors would suffer his fate of an overthrow by coup and exile. The social differences of colonial Saint-Domingue looped around concentric orbs of class, region, and color, making Haiti by the 1840s a very divided place, where political rivals launched attacks on each other for state power. Here, unlike the other places of the Caribbean, freedom from slavery was bound up in the concept of national belonging. To be Haitian was to be free, but that legal right of being Haitian could be disturbed constitutionally in the frequent internecine struggles for power. 1844 was a different time than 1794. Freedom meant something else, especially to the increasingly mobile community of Haitian exiles and immigrants who were forced to leave their homelands in search of ephemeral freedom somewhere else. In their new Caribbean homes, they took the saga of what Black freedom from slavery was and could be with all its messiness. Boyer's allies used Kingston to plot against his successors. When their time came, they swapped places at the harbor, and each transfer put another knot in the loop of connection that raveled Spanish Cuba with British Jamaica, Danish St. Thomas, with independent Haiti. Each place brought to their exchanges a different comprehension of the age of emancipation. It could be trade and kinship. It could be finance for warfare, especially during Cuba's successive wars against Spain with the 10 Years' War and later. And it could also be demonstrations of what a post-slavery Caribbean might be. It has been one of my longest intellectual concerns to study this history of colliding ideas and experiences of freedom in the 19th century Caribbean. What was it like for Haitians in full enjoyment of a freedom defined as much by anti-colonialism and revolution as human liberty, to engage with a just freed society where the apparatus of slavery was still laying in the cane fields and in the minds, words, and actions of white colonists? I have searched for answers through tracking the elites along their courses of exile. I have understood their intra-island movements as a valued freedom. It was not earned easily. The political challenges of post-revolutionary Haiti might have created a mobile community of emigrants, but that came with separation, unguaranteed citizenship, and isolation. It was common that rivals, once exiled and banished, could be stripped of their right to return to Haiti. And by Haitian law, if an exiled woman married a non-Haitian, she would be stripped of her citizenship, forced to reapply for Haitian citizenship as a person not born in Haiti who wished to become a citizen of the Republic. These circumstances produced many outcomes for Haiti's mobile outcomes, and also mobile communities, and also many definitions and practices of freedom that have long fascinated me. There's a story that I encountered in my research very early on that has long stayed with me and which I've not done much with it in my writing. It is an encounter between a Jamaican journalist and a 19th century Haitian general exiled in Kingston. The unnamed man sits at the Kingston harbor day after day, looking past the colonial brickworks at the Caribbean Sea longingly, lonely. He waits for some news from Haiti and is unsettled from his fall from grace and the penury of exile. It is symbolic, the underside of freedom in a way. But the unknown general is product of the imprecision of his time. And though a privileged man by comparison with the majority of Haitians, his experience of movement comes with a cost. It is a cost known to the Jamaicans, African Americans, and other Caribbeans who went in the opposite direction to Haiti in the 19th century in search of a freedom denied them after slavery. There were few who succeeded to find it. Most did not have property rights and were foreign to the problems of the country, so attached themselves to the places where they came from. For those from the British Islands living in Haiti, they proudly mounted the British flag outside their homes as security during times of conflict and reminder that they belong not to a country, but to an empire. In the British Islands, though, after slavery, the majority could not leave. And their stories of how they negotiated their freedom in the 1850s and 1860s are remarkable insights into the failures of the abolitionist project. In the so-called free villages operated by missionary groups, many rural Jamaicans worked to purchase tiny plots of land to cultivate on, to teach themselves and their children to read, and organize their working lives in accordance to their needs. They looked for family members separated by slavery, and new kinship ties flourished in towns and districts across the islands, some renamed to reflect the new age of redemption: Hopeful Village, Freedom Village, Augusttown, and so on. On the first anniversary of full freedom in Jamaica in August 1839, in Falmouth, in the northwestern part of the island, after an all-night watch party in the local Wesleyan church, a freed person got up and delivered a testimony on what freedom meant to him. Before freedom, he said, and these are his words, "We no know day but Tuesday and Thursday, beef day and Monday turnout day. Now we know Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and the blessed Sunday. Before time we flogged for looking a book, for pray, for picking up a bit of paper and reading it. Now no flog, no chain, no workhouse. We free. Gospel make we free. My brothers and sisters, make we use this free well." For agricultural work, they were still tied to the sugar and coffee estates as wage workers or jobbers. And they were still open to the abuses of the planter class who only legally accepted them as free. They were in other respects exploitable laborers from who the avaricious planters extracted everything they could for as little as possible. After Britain's Sugar Duties Act of 1846 came into effect and removed their long-held monopolies, the desperate planters overworked their laborers. A wonderful poem that I found in research years ago that appeared in the Port of Spain Gazette in 1854 captured the woe of the collapse of the British planter in this era of free trade. It was called The Last Planter, and it contained the following stanza. His wild eye had a feverish glare, his face with care was wan. The marks of desolation were around that ruined man. His former friends were gone or dead, to foreign shores some few had fled, to California some, to Cuba and the southern states, or yielding to their too stern fates, had died of grief or rum. The hapless planter cried, he took a long last lingering swill, then plunged into the revolving mill. Thus the last planter died. Very interesting poem. But the planter refused to die without a fight against the free workers they were intent on abusing. And in Jamaica, the situation was notoriously vicious. Here's a comment from a worker named William East, given in the mid-1860s. Quote, the payment is so bad and the task is so heavy, and people get only 3 shillings or 2 and 6 pence a week. We can't survive, end quote. The planters had the justice system on their side, and so the abuse was not only in labor relations, but also in social treatment. Laborers who took to the courts were often disregarded and illiberally punished. In a testimony given by a freed person named William Clark on the injustices in Jamaica, he said, quote, one time I was present in court when 2 or 3 boys were tried for rolling a cart on some sprout canes, as they were called. The carts were being driven in the field, and the wheels of 2 carts went on the cane bank. And these 2 boys were brought up for maliciously destroying the canes. I was present, and they were fined 18 shillings or 20 days imprisonment, and their wages were to be stopped for 3 weeks that were due them. The profound inequality of post-slavery societies and its effect on the laboring classes was brought out dramatically in the evidence of the Royal Commission report on the Morant Bay Rebellion, from where my above examples were taken. The report was conducted to investigate the circumstances leading to the events of the rebellion in eastern Jamaica in October 1865. The commissioners took testimony from freed people, which underscored their lives and treatment. It was treatment like the one of the 2 boys that precipitated the actions of the protesters in Morant Bay and the rising that was led by future national hero Paul Bogle. It also awoke a discussion on the great limitations of freedom, and it awoke colonial white fears. The governor of Jamaica, Edward John Eyre, responded with a violent bloodletting in which over 400 persons were executed on false implication in the event. Hundreds of others had their homes burned down and were brutally flogged in ways that brought back all the visceral memories of slavery. Here is the 1866 testimony of one witness as to the treatment of a woman accused of protecting her husband, who is believed to have been sympathetic to Bogle's cause. And I should warn you, it's a violent testimony. When they flogged Mrs. Livingston and gave her 4 and 5 lashes, they saw the wire cut her back. And they said, this cat, the cat of 9, won't do to flog the woman. So they changed it, and they went upstairs and got another cat without wire. And then they began to give her the balance of her lashes. The flogging of Mrs. Livingston and other women continued for a solid week. Eyre's barbarism caused his recall from Jamaica and stirred a protracted debate in England on the state of the colonies. The events of Morant Bay have been one of the memorialized and most studied chapters of the post-slavery Caribbean. And what is striking in all the evidence and history writing was how they indicate the deeply divided understanding of post-slavery citizenship and belonging. For white colonists, the events of 1865, which in addition to the violence led to the utter dissolution of Jamaica's assembly and erosion of one of the most cherished freedoms of Jamaican elites, and direct crown rule, and realized the worst fears they held in 1838. Without slavery, the planters and colonialists had long uttered, it would be a matter of time before black violence would engulf the islands. The crystallization of this racist view, which never allowed for the way the violence of slavery itself was sown into colonial societies, came in the notorious book, The English in the West Indies, by Victorian historian, novelist, and disciple of Thomas Carlyle, James Anthony Froude, who I mentioned yesterday as well. Froude's controversial book was a defense of British colonialism, presented as the one saving grace of the post-slavery Caribbean. His acerbic conclusion, based on a brief tour of the islands, which also included a visit to Haiti, projected the thought of English writers after 1865. Here's a conclusion from Froude. Slavery is gone with all that belonged to it, but it will be an ill day for mankind if no one is to be compelled anymore to obey those who are wiser than himself, and each of us is to do only what is right in our own eyes. There may be authority, yet not slavery. A soldier is not a slave. A sailor is not a slave. A child is not a slave. A wife is not a slave. Yet they may not live by their own wills or emancipate themselves at their own pleasure from positions in which nature has placed them or into which they themselves have voluntarily entered. The Negroes of the West Indies are children, and not yet disobedient children. They have their dreams, but for the present, they are dreams only. If you enforce self-government upon them when they are not asking for it, you may turn the dream into reality and willfully drive them back into the condition of their ancestors, from which the slave trade was the beginning of their emancipation. A very difficult passage to read in 2024. Froude called the Morant Day events as inevitable from the divisions in Jamaica, but he did not see these divisions as unfair to the Black population. On the contrary, Froude argued that there were not enough numbers to maintain the colonial racial hierarchy. In fact, he was a strong proponent of increasing, not decreasing, imperialism. In his English view, as it was for post-slavery advocates from South Carolina to Pernambuco, Haiti was a frightening example of what would happen to the Caribbean islands should colonialism not assert itself. Here's what he says on that score. We at home can be calm because we know that there is no real danger and that the law is strong enough to assert itself. In Jamaica, a few thousand white people were living in the middle of Negroes 40 times their number. Once their slaves now raised to be their political equals, each regarding the other on the least provocation with resentment and suspicion. In England, the massacre in Haiti is a half-forgotten story. In Jamaica, it is ever present in the minds of the European as a frightful evidence of what the Negroes are capable of when roused to frenzy, end quote. A Jamaican laborer put it even more succinctly in 1865. Haiti has been the cry of the planters for 35 or 36 years, and to them it means to cut white people's throats, end quote. The shorthand of Haiti and freedom from slavery as a horror was enduring among colonists, but it was contested by Caribbean writers. From Trinidadian J.J. Thomas to Bahamian Theophilus Scholes, there was a movement to counter Froude and others like Spencer St. John, who was equally disparaging of Haiti's example of freedom. But in Haiti in these years, the years of the 1860s to the 1880s, these were difficult years. The power struggles had become more acute. In the many political clashes of this era, some political leaders bartered Haitian freedom, promising some degree of control to foreign countries in return for support for their own rule. Joseph Robert Love, a Bahamian doctor and journalist living in Port-au-Prince, who would later become a major inspiration for Marcus Garvey in Kingston, wrote with regret about how political problems had undermined the goals of Haitian freedom. He said, quote, "I have found that Haitians have strayed so far from the idea of 1804, end quote. Citizenship, race, nationalism, what all these words meant in the era of tightening British colonialism after 1865, and on the eve of US military presence in the Caribbean, powered Caribbean writers to adjust their ideas about emancipation, which was being redefined in terms of power and access to power. Slavery's memory could become a political weapon. In Haiti's chaotic decade between US Marine invasion in 1915, President Noor Alexis posted images of captured Africans in coffles to suggest this was what was to happen should the United States intervene and control the Republic. On the approach to the centenary of Haitian independence in 1904, a zealous nationalist slipped this note under the door of the British legation in Port-au-Prince that recalled the pride of 1804 in the pressing years when foreign intervention, especially after the US invasion of Cuba, was a very real possibility. When slavery was recalled to a generation 50 years past its absolute end, in political discourses of the late 19th century into the 20th century, it was a past event, reduced in national memory, superseded by the story of freedom. In Jamaica in 1888, which was the time of the celebration of 50 years of emancipation, there was what was known as Jamaica's Jubilee. And a book was published at that time, edited by a man named Reverend R. Gordon, and it was called Jamaica's Jubilee, or What We Are and What We Hope to Be, which reflected on a half century of emancipation. It's an interesting insight in what emancipation meant 50 years on to people in Jamaica, and it was one that could be extrapolated and expanded across the British Islands. Here's one of Gordon's conclusions in that book. In the course of the last half century, in order to show that despite the unuttered and degraded condition in which emancipation found them, the many and serious evils entailed on them by slavery, the incalculable disadvantages and untold discouragements under which they had to labor as freedmen, they have not been forgetful of the fact that as freemen, they're required to stand side by side with their white neighbors in the battle against wrong and the encouragement and promotion of those virtues, qualities, and excellences that characterize a free and civilized people, end quote. Gordon and his fellow contributors, in making a case for the virtues of freedom, glided over the hard injustices that came after 1838. They do not mention in the book Morant Bay. There's no extensive discussion of the injustices that led to that event. There was no discussion of the denial of political rights, land rights, and opportunity to the majority of free Jamaicans. 60 years ago, he says, our ancestors were imbruted and enslaved and without one glimmering ray of light in the dark future. And he says that obstacle is now taken out of the way. Freedom was actively being redefined for new purposes as the Caribbean approached another era of transformation at century's end. It was wrested from the people who inherited it to a new class of aspirants for power in the march to decolonization, who took on themselves the right to narrate the Caribbean's brutal past. But their story is to come. It is not those with stakes in political power from whom we must draw the final comment on what freedom from slavery meant. It is the people who survived slavery, the last generation of enslaved persons who still bore the marks of violence and understood abolition viscerally. Their stories were legacies that they handed down, a living memory among them that they wanted to continue to breathe and be passed on by their kin, that their personal testimony of experiences could not be forgotten. There would be statues to Queen Victoria and the colonial men who they were told to praise, but no statues to commemorate the ones who made it to the end of slavery. And so it was they who had to keep the memory alive. The records from this generation are scant. There's no equivalent to the voluminous WPA records in the United States, which contain first-hand oral accounts of hundreds of the last generation of free persons in the Caribbean. But in the Caribbean, the fragments are many, and we must collect them, and we must think on them. In 1888, the year of the Golden Law in Brazil bringing slavery to an end in the Americas, was also the year of the 50th anniversary of slavery, ending of slavery in Jamaica. And it was the survivors who took the lead in ensuring the occasion would be appropriately recognized. Collections were taken in churches and public districts in Jamaica to raise funds for Jubilee dinners. In Trelawney, Baptists circulated medallions and hymn books with freedom songs to be sung on August 1st. In St. Margaret's Bay in the east, there was an all-night vigil, and at midnight the bells of the church tolled and people fell to their knees and prayed. 12 hours later, nearly 600 people in that district marched to the sound of rolling drums and holding up pennants with the words, God save the Queen, rule Britannia, education, and at the head of the march, a pennant that said freedom. At most of these events, the aged survivors of slavery were the guests of honor. At Gordon Town's Jubilee dinner, 100 formerly enslaved people were seated for a banquet dinner of roast sheep, cakes, beef, and rum. They were applauded, waited on, and honored. Among them was a 95-year-old mother of 15 children, all born into slavery. And sitting beside her were her twin sons, who were 70, also born into slavery. The weight of the moment for them would have been great. After the feast, some of these survivors were invited to speak. The congregation heard them recount their terror and watched them closely, hanging on to every word to understand the personal pain they endured and still carried. Children sat with their jaws slacked as they learned of routine abuse and what ownership of human beings meant stories they would never forget after they heard them. Such storytelling was a common feature of all the Jubilee events. In Vere Clarendon, a committee of sons of the emancipated slaves organized their own celebration, bringing their parents to speak to the next generation of Jamaicans who gathered at their feet. A man named Thomas Nangle, born into slavery in 1763, was a special guest. And after the dinner, he recounted to the gathering the feel of the whip, the cat-o'-nine, and the ebony when it struck his torso. He described the treadmill and how it pulled apart limbs. The children sat in awed silence. And back in Gordon Town, where the group of 100 survivors chatted about slavery, one among them, an old man, got up from the table. He produced a whip and told the audiences it was the whip that was used to beat him his whole life. And he spoke in details that would have made Tennyson's grave old motto, "Sat high, weep." When he was finished, he threw the whip to the ground and thanked God for his and their freedom. Thank you.
Once again, I want to thank you for another beautiful, poetic journey through history, and in so many ways for bringing to life with these stories some of the challenges that I know you discuss in your work with the British, the Legacies of British Slavery Project.
Yeah.
And before I open it to the audience, I just wanted to start there for a moment, because I know one of the challenges that you've faced and addressed head on when you first became director was that it was the Legacies of British Slave Ownership Project. And I do remember, I hope you don't mind me telling the audience, a Zoom call that we had where you said, it will not be on my watch that this continues to have slave owner as one of the first words you see, you know, defining this project. So the work that you outline here, you know, tells a very different kind of story. And I wondered if you could just reflect for a moment on that work that you're doing and these stories that you're trying to tease out about what freedom meant to the people who experienced it as emancipated people.
Yes, thank you for that, Melanie. Thank you very much. A big part of all the work that ties it together, what I presented and the work we're doing at the center, is trying to really showcase that the story of what happened during slavery is a story that's very much tied to the experiences of enslaved persons, their descendants, and the memories around that. And that is, as you rightly point out, often a challenge. It's a challenge in terms of the evidence, that's one thing. And one of the points we discussed at a session earlier today was that there's actually evidence, there are fragments. It's a question of how you approach those fragments and piece them together to tell the story. But there's also a bigger challenge than that, which is the challenge of being able to converse with a historiographic tradition that has often approached this from the perspective of the enslavers, even with a recognition of the limitations of that, but still a sort of privileging of the records of the enslavers. And that, I think, is a tradition that evolves not only out of the sort of meta-narrative of abolitionism in British historiography, wherever it intersects with slavery, but also, quite frankly, evolves out of colonialism, in which the records produced in the archive of empire is seen as holding greater value to the study of the history of colonies than the records produced in colonies. And one of the ways in which, and this is where it comes into questions of methodology, one of the ways in which we are at the center, and in some of what we heard this evening with my work, that we're trying to access that, is looking at records produced in the islands, right? The civil records in the islands, but also newspapers. And some of the stories I shared were actually pulled from newspaper research, and that shows that you can actually reach some of these experiences that way.
Okay, thank you. Want to open to the audience? I mean, we can talk forever, but
Yeah.
while you're finding your feet, I do have another question.
Please.
So one thing I was thinking of as you were um, telling some of the stories about, just the hardships of post-emancipation life in Jamaica is some of the early post-emancipation scholarship that came out of the University of the West Indies that was so important, particularly the narrative of, the flight from the estates.
Yeah.
And for those, who don't know, that there's a bit of an element of that in the story you told about this apocalyptic vision from the perspective of planters in the empire of the collapse of the plantations that, without sufficient legal restraints, enslaved people would flee, plantation labor and kind of an irrational, like slavery would, the horrors of slavery would impel them into, poverty or like anyhow, all kinds of crazy narratives. But there is a scholarship that really looks at the choice that many enslaved people made not to remain in plantation labor in Jamaica in particular. So I wondered, like how you relate the work that you're doing, these stories, and this emphasis on hardships of that period, to that story of the flight from the estates.
Yeah, it's a good one too. I mean, this Douglas Hall was a pioneering historian who did this and did a very unusual thing, which I often highlight to students because he was wrong. He admitted his own error in his original interpretation, then corrected it with an article called "Flight from the Estates Reconsidered," which is a great article to read, and it's a sign of a historian accepting where they might have erred in their interpretation. What I think is crucial is to understand, coming out of Hall's work and the other historians have picked up on it, that the way in which freedom was understood and activated after slavery varied, and people had different definitions of it. But what was really crucial was that it involved some degree of control. So even in the instance where you had people who chose to remain on the estates because, for various reasons, some of it was wage work, but also families and networks were around the community of the estate. There is a lot of evidence, and Hall points this out, and other scholars like Swithin Wilmot and others have demonstrated this a lot in their work, that they wanted to control the time, they wanted to control the hours of the work that they did, and so on. And that's an important element for us, how we're trying to understand freedom, that it involves even just the control of time and negotiation of that. There are also questions about family and the sort of reconstitution of the family, which has also been studied by post-emancipation scholars like Jenny Jemmett has written about this, and that there was a way in which their lives were shaped by being in spaces where their families could be there. I suppose what I'm saying is one of the things we stress a lot in our work at the center is to understand the complicated human responses to freedom from slavery, that it could not be one thing. It had to be different things at different times in different places, and trying to find ways to listen to what that meant at that point in time. And crucial to that as well is understanding the broader social context in which that was operating. They were completely aware of their society, their district, their environment, and freedom was defined and redefined in relation to that. So like the Morant Bay Rebellion has a certain effect, and there's a certain way after the Morant Bay Rebellion that people are understanding what freedom is. And so where you can find those voices, I mean, one of the quotes that I used in the lecture actually was from the Wesleyan Methodist records at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, which I've consulted. And you find these pieces, these extracts, and there's a voice in it that's recorded and that's there. And it gives you yet another sense of what that meant. And for me, that one always stood out, that freedom meant I know the days of the week. Because when I was enslaved, I didn't know the days of the week, right? So being able to step back as a historian and not impose on the freed persons, what you expect them to have done. Yeah.
Sorry, just have an online
Oops,
question.
sorry.
Someone has asked basically just if you could speak more on like the initiatives newly freed people created, such as the development of food collectives, the building of schools and churches, village markets, and any other types of infrastructure? I know it's a lot, but maybe some of them.
Yeah, sure. There were a lot of such initiatives for sure. Part of it is around market structures, and it also varies again. I mean, I won't go into too much here since a lot of our conversation thus far has been on the British Caribbean islands. But in Haiti, though, the market economies that were set up after slavery ended was really, really important. It was developed what Haitian sociologist Jean Casimir has referred to as the counterplantation, that it was an economic system that in Haiti they call it la cour, that sort of which essentially just means a sort of courtyard or yard in Creole. And in the la cour system was one in which there was autonomy over the production of crops for sale, and that was what people did. There are versions of that in other islands as well. Sydney Mintz referred to it as a proto-peasantry structure. There was also, as the questioner has asked, the point about building of schools and education being fundamental and being able to develop systems internally within the villages around that. Absolutely crucial. And it's a sort of form of cooperative that was happening. And the missionary records, again, give us loads of examples of that, certainly. And a big one, too, is the political power, extremely limited during this period. Who could vote was based on, the franchise was based on land ownership. And it's really remarkable when you look at the evidence to see how people got together to raise funds to buy land so someone could actually vote, because that gave them, and it might have been a very tiny fraction of a district or a community, but it was enough for them to rally together to have somebody who could speak on their behalf in the assembly, in the case of Jamaica, for the Morant Bay Rebellion, and advocate for them. Those things are really profound examples, really, of people coming together after slavery ended to demonstrate what their freedom could be. Paul Bogle was very instrumental in that. Religion, as well as another space for that, in sort of marshaling support for George William Gordon, who became their representative in the assembly in Jamaica. So that's another example. Political rights, economic autonomy through market systems, religion and education and family were key.
Thank you for a very interesting and inspiring talk. You've spoken about freedom from a historical perspective, freedom as it was viewed in the past. I don't know if this is part of your scholarship, but how has the promise of freedom been realized, and to what extent? How is freedom seen today more from a social perspective, not a political one?
Yeah. Short answer, if you can come to tomorrow's talk, you'll get a longer answer to that, because it has been so wedded now to anti-colonialism, anti-racism, anti any form of state abuse of power in the Caribbean. A lot of that is very much embroiled in concepts of what freedom is. And one of the challenges is how those modern or current conceptions and definitions of freedom still carry the ideals that the ancestors, the freed people, and even before them, the generations that were enslaved, defined freedom. Because one of the things that is very intriguing for me when I look at this is how it moves conceptually. And as it's moving, there are certain central aspects of what freedom is that is carried on. And then it's very clear in the 19th century evidence. And a lot of those sorts of ideas of freedom come down to questions of self-definition control and exercise of autonomy of the individual. Now, this can be debated very much so, but I do think that one can look at how people describe, interestingly, the example I gave of Elsa Gavallo telling students in 1953, if you want to understand slavery, look at segregation in the US, look at apartheid in South Africa. I also think in a similar way, you could also think about people define freedom and non-freedom, not necessarily slavery, but on freedom, because there are definitions and ways in which people in the Caribbean talk about not being free. And that gives you some insight in what that lineage of freedom has been and how it's been carried, right? And sometimes that's in the practice. I'm not going to work today. I'm not going to, I'm taking that because that's my freedom to do that. And that's an interesting insight as well. Now, we have to be careful. It doesn't necessarily mean it's exactly what it was back then, but it is an evidence of that sort of connection through the generations.
Yes, I just wanted to also offer something for you in response to that question. Many years ago, I looked through the archives of the British anti-apartheid movement in Rhodes House, and looked at some of the very early years of the movement when it was really led by some exiles from the African continent, from Southern Africa, but then also students from across the African continent.
Yeah.
Who were in Britain. And one of their very, very first campaigns, I think it was in the late 1950s, I don't remember the exact year, was a campaign with pamphlets that said, boycott slave owners' goods. And in the subsequent years, they would kind of be pushed out and you would have very different leaders taking over. But this moment for them, in terms of the message that these were pamphlets that were all over the UK. And that was the analogy that they chose. So precisely that point that Elsa Gavallo made, if you want to understand this history, look at apartheid, look at that resonance, that echo over time and reverberation, that these things are not the same, but yet they are intimately tied to each other.
Absolutely.
Like they saw that.
They saw that relationship there. Yeah. And, to the point as well, it's one of the things that I was stressing, that we, even as historians and scholars and really searching to have a grasp on what these multiple definitions and actions on freedom were, need to always be cautious ourselves in not imposing that. Because there is sometimes a way that we anticipate that it has to be defined on a recognition of ownership and a resistance to that ownership. But sometimes it could be so much more. It could be emotive. I'll give an anecdote on that. In 2003, it was the eve of the bicentenary of Haitian independence. And in November 2003, I was in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince, and a friend of mine said, I know you're a historian and you're interested in Haitian history. There's an all-girls school in downtown Port-au-Prince that was doing a play on Haitian independence. I'm an alum of that school, and I'd like to invite you to come and see it. I said, sure, I'd love to see it. So I sat in the outside courtyard of this school, and these girls, came in costume, and I was very excited to see, that, Haitian students depicting their history this way. And they began to line in a row here. And I could follow the chronology. I know when they were coming, having read C.L.R. James, The Black Jacobins, and all these books about the Haitian Revolution. I was ready for that epic moment. And all the girls were in a row here, hunched over, as if they were chopping cane with a papier-mâché cane field in front of them. And at one point, one of them got up straight, and she walked to the edge of the stage. And she had her hands in front of her like this, and she looked above the audience's head at like an invisible spot, and she let out a wail. She just screamed and screamed and screamed for 5 minutes nonstop. And it was a scream of pain, it was a scream of sorrow, then it became a scream of victory. And after she screamed, she put her head down, and the other girls stood up and raised the Haitian flag. That's how they depicted the Haitian Revolution. There was no grand storming of people on horses and so on. It was all in a scream. And I was in tears at the end. I couldn't believe what I had witnessed. But it was a reminder again that as much as we are so moved by the material we find in the archives, the stories we collect, we also have to always be, and I tell my students this all the time, remember we're holding other people's histories and stories, and they have different ways that different meanings to them. And we have to be respectful of that.
Thank you so much.
So I'm going to ask two questions. The first one, in your last story you were telling in 1888, recalling the gentleman who threw the whip down on the ground.
Yeah.
So with these stories, are you guys, meeting the university, the legacy database, are you putting all these stories online for us to read? And also, this is part of the first question, will you guys also be collecting artifacts from slave times to tie in, to tell the stories too? And the other question is, where is the database heading to? What's your next project?
Okay, thanks. So with the first question, the short answer is no. This was actually stories I collected in my preparation for this lecture series. So it's not actually, it's not emergent from work that we're doing at the center. We haven't gone that far in the center work. So that's an answer to that. The second question about artifacts, we actually don't collect artifacts. We are, we say we do public history for the public. So it's all what's available online, but we don't actually collect artifacts, as it were. Though we do a lot of consultative work with museums that do that in the UK. So we do a lot of work with the major ones that have galleries or exhibition spaces that deal with histories of slavery in Liverpool, Bristol, and London. The third question you asked that we're doing is that we are now centering actually completely in our work the enslaved persons as our focus. And so we're looking at the registers of enslaved persons that were filed triennially from 1817 to 1832. As you mentioned earlier, Melanie, in some islands it goes up to a little later. I think in Trinidad it went up to 1834, and it started earlier in 1816 somewhere. But we're looking at those, and we want to create a database of all the names of persons who are enslaved. So these were registers that every person who owned someone had to file, which you've worked with this data. And we're now going to create a database of all of that material. There are lots of issues with that. Questions about the, what does it do? A big element, motivating factor for us is the memorialization aspect to it. By naming persons and having that out there, that's a major, major thing. So we don't just have it as it currently exists, where you have the names of a slave owner, and you say that, and you have all the biodata on the slave owner, and you say that person owned 150 persons. It's sort of, inverting that. It's about the story of the 150 persons, not the person who owned them. But there are also questions about ethics, right? Because this is Black data that will then become, available publicly. And even though this is data of persons who have long passed, those persons have relatives today that we have to think about and be respectful to how we represent them in the database. So that's a big question that we're working through at the center. But that's where we're heading.
There was a second part to the question about the work you're doing now.
Oh,
Yeah.
was that the answer?
Oh, no. Oh,
Yeah.
that was okay.
Yeah.
So we have a question from someone in Ireland named Margaret, and she's asking if you could say something about to what extent land ownership formed parts of ideas of freedom for freed people in the first 50 years.
Yes, that's right. And it comes back to an earlier question about what is freedom still today. Land ownership is crucial to the sense of actually having something that belongs to you
because of the ways in which enslaved people have been tied to land that didn't belong to them. So there had been this long, ambition to own land as a realization of the promise of freedom. And so people worked very, very hard to realize that fact. That denial of land ownership, both at the in terms of what they were given access to, in terms of planters in the first instance, just immediately after slavery ended, but then also colonial denial of land and post-colonial denial of land has remained a major issue of contention over whether or not people feel they're truly free if they don't own land. That's been very, very important in people's, that's been a continual aspect of people's definitions of freedom to this day. We see often, many of us who are from the Caribbean, the ways in which when someone owns a piece of land and they build a house on the land, and often they're building rooms in that house for relatives who live outside of the Caribbean, because they want to say that there is a room here for you that we own that will belong to you. And that's a sense of pride. In the first 50 years after, this was always a search. As I said, it was an unrealized search in most instances. And that very tiny percentage was able to own land, what that power gave them as free people in terms of access to the franchise, but also that power within the community and within the district and within themselves, that it was something that belonged to them.
You have another question?
Can you talk a little bit about your own experience? Because you mentioned Elsa Govaya and how her teaching of slavery, she felt she had to evolve it as the context around her changed. You've been teaching history for over 30 years now. Can you talk a little bit about how time and external context have influenced or not what you teach about slavery?
Oh, thank you for that question, Dr. Govaya. I think time and place as well, because I've had the benefit of teaching in 3 countries, Jamaica, the US, and the UK now. And I think that what has changed a lot is what people bring to the understanding of the past students. And I have to also accept that they're coming in at different levels and different relationships to the past of slavery. For some in the UK currently, a lot of them don't know this history. It's very foreign, very detached, very distant. And what they know of it quite often is the history of abolitionism or the history of a sort of post-colonial Caribbean, Windrush, even before post-colonial infusion in British culture. But they don't understand what it really means. And so I have to be able to unpick that and figure out how to experience, how to meet that experience by showing them this as something new and different, but in a way in which it's tied into their own knowledge of Britain. In the US, it's very different when I've taught students there histories of slavery, because they come at it from a very, the experience of slavery in the US South, and assume that what happens in the Caribbean is the same pattern, and having to make them realize it's not. But there are ways in which the parallels in those experiences can enlighten even how they understand the history of the United States is important. One way you do that quite often, I find, is showing them the connections pre the American War for Independence, where it was all part of this unit known as British Empire. And in Jamaica, it's been, the most transformative over the years I've been teaching experience, because there, a lot of students find a relationship to the history of slavery as so bound up in their history of being Jamaican being Caribbean, it's an origin story of who they are. But also there is this view that the history of slavery is tied into a nationalist project that a younger generation sometimes resist. So that I must learn the history of slavery the way I must learn the national anthem. And I don't want to learn that anymore. And also it's a story of Black victimhood that they are resistant to as well. And so I've had students reject certain topics in slavery to me and say, I don't want to learn that. I would like to learn something else about Black history other than slavery. And that's really fascinating because I have to remind them that when Elsa Cavallo was doing that tour of the high schools in 1953, that was the very year she developed and designed the very first course in Caribbean history ever taught at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, which might have been the very first course in Caribbean history taught across the whole of the British Caribbean at the time. And I reminded students this was 1953. That's not that long ago. And so a lot of people worked very, very hard so you could get the knowledge that you are now telling me you don't want to own or hold anymore. You want a different knowledge. But again, you have to be sensitive to what they're bringing to it. And there are reasons why they're saying that, because they're living poverty and crime and all of these things, fragmentation of families, all of these things. And they want to have a different relationship to that. And so you have to be aware of that too.
You have one last question here and then one.
I would like to know from you if you think that Cuba has dealt better with their past of slavery.
I think that Cuba might have, particularly Cuba in the Castro years, might think it has, but in some ways it hasn't. Because the legacy of it has often been the race relations within post-slavery states. And I think that what, in the Cuban example, there has been assumption that communism and socialism removed racial differentiation, when in fact it has not. And there has also been the big question as to how do you teach and write and engage the history of Cuban slavery in Cuba? And if the history is written and engaged with in a way that is reflective of the lead to what socialism is meant to have corrected and brought to Cuba, then there are elements to it that are not necessarily embraced or discussed in variation. That said, the presence of enslavement as part of the Cuban nation story is unavoidable. It's very clear in the histories of Cuba that you have to confront. And I think one of the benefits is that Cuban historiography is probably the most developed historiography of any island in the Caribbean. So even if there exists, as I've just defined it, a way of redefining and representing Cuban history in the present, there's so much you can go to in the history writing of Cuba to give you the alternate views of it. In fact, when I was writing these lectures, Cuba figured a lot more prominently than it has now. For the sake of space and resolution in the lectures, I decided not to focus on Cuba because Cuba is so fundamental in understanding a lot of these issues, the issues of freedom, the issues of revolution, the issues of just sort of redefining history. And I think that, you can't escape it. And even just the notions of what is Caribbean culture and so on, a lot of that's really been fundamentally sourced by Cuba, and emigration to Cuba and emigration out of Cuba.
I believe we have one question online. And
It's actually a comment.
comment.
Yeah.
Well, would you mind if we could take there's a one question in the room as well. And then we'll have the comment.
Thank you so much for this insightful lecture. My question was, Sort of looking into maybe how modes of maybe unfreedom or domination have been reproduced in the post-emancipation era. So even thinking in the example of the Asian Laku system, for example, and I think there is a tendency at time to romanticize it in a way that was a place of autonomy, of freedom for the newly freed people, but how might maybe sort of domination on the line of gender and color still reproduced within those places that attempted to be counterplantation to be entire.
Yes, excellent. And very true as well that there are ways in which you do have the practices of on-freedom reinforced, and that even when you have acquisition of power, whatever that might be, land rights, etc., that power is exercised in a way that supports domination, as to use your word, and that's true. You see it in the Haitian case very clearly, and you see it in other places as well, post-emancipation. And we also have to be alert to that's there, that evidence is there. It was in the Haitian case deeply masculine structure that emerged and reinforced by the state, which was a military state, effectively, in the sense that all the Haitian leaders were military men and so on, and that sort of sense of hypermasculinity through the persona of the male military soldier is also something that is seen in those kinds of ways. And yes, you're right. I mean, who is actually feeling free in that sense, right? It's not everybody. It's definitely not women in many instances, and and you see that very clearly even in places where you have in the British colonies after slavery ended, you have these different ways in which power is redefined and exercised. I agree, and we have to be careful to not romanticize it. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, someone has put a comment, like a personal anecdote that talked about, they said, one of my ancestors said freedom meant for her leaving the sugarcane fields on the plains of Westmoreland, Jamaica, and going to the hills where she could have her own plot of land and raise her children away from estate life. This story was passed down through children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. And she just asked if you could comment kind of on that.
Yeah, I'm glad that questioner has had that story passed down. That's important because it becomes a family tradition that's upheld and also a source of connection to the relative. And yeah, very true. We get we find those examples in the records from time to time of what people say of what freedom meant for them. And yeah, thanks for that comment. Who made it? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your questions and for your generous answers. And now you'll hear from the principal of University College, Professor Tagliamonte. Thank you so much.
I don't know about you, but I don't think I'll think of the days of the week again without thinking about freedom and what a privilege it is for us to have it. So thank you. This concludes tonight's programming. Thank you all for the thoughtful questions that you brought to the floor. I'd like to take this opportunity to tell you about upcoming lectures that you might be interested in. On November 21st, we will have the W.J. Alexander lecture in English, which will be given by Professor Warren Cadario, Department of English, Theatre, Film, and Media, Faculty of Arts at our very own University of Manitoba. The title of his talk is Petromimesis, Carbon Kinship, and Reflections in Stone. And then coming up in January, on the last day of the month, the 31st, will be the Stubbs Lecture in English Literature, which will be given by Claire Petit from Cambridge University in the UK. Professor Petit is a specialist in the literary ideas of the 19th century. Her current work investigates the origins of the linked phenomena of structural racism, climate change, and nationalism. And her lecture will be held on the 31st. Stay tuned to the website for the title and details. As you are bearing witness to, the University College Endowed Lectures are a fantastic opportunity to hear from renowned scholars talking about things that they are most passionate about and bringing to us riveting stories that will influence our own lives and the things that we think about. I encourage you all to come and to attend, and I hope that I will see you there. I've already started to get to know some of you. So special thanks to Melanie Newton for being our amazing moderator, Bonnie Hung for running our technology that allows people out there in the world to be here with us, even though we can't see them, and all the students, staff, and faculty involved in planning Dr. Smith's visit. And especially you, Matthew, thank you for yet another inspiring talk. You have a way of telling us stories that we won't forget. Thank you for coming. The final lecture will be tomorrow.